So now we are helping land to bring all those kind of education contents from Europe to Japan.
Really?
Yes, and we help them to do the localization and distribution. And DEIs and agile mindset, design thinking, and how can you have unconscious bias. So it's very focused on the soft skill parts about how can we help the team to communicate well, help the leadership to build the way how they should lead the team, right? And how they should build out the businesses.
Okay. Did you join any accelerator program?
So I didn't participate on the it's kind of accelerator program, but I did apply for sign up the program that helped us to go global. So I was working with JETRO. Yeah, so they are the organization to help Japanese company to go global and help international company to come to Japan, right? So, and we were selected two of the program. One is called X Hub, another is called Beyond Japan. So with that program, we were able to learn and how to expand the business from Japan to global by introducing us with a lot of like mentors, and as well as actually go with that program to the Silicon Valley as well as Los Angeles, right? And to again, we talk to the partner there, talk to the clients there, and with that program, actually we help a lot is because we be able to find actually the business partners like partnerships during that program. So we met with one of the biggest like e-learning content providers from Europe in US actually. Yes, and we talk with each other.
Is this last year?
This was yeah, it was 2 years ago actually. Yeah, and so we met each other at the end of 2 years ago. Then and we kind of understand a lot and about like how important it is to bring the knowledge to the working professionals. And I'm very impressed about the quality and the contents that I've been building, like original contents. It's like a drama type of e-learning contents. Very interesting. Like people don't like to watch boring like learning contents. People feel sleepy about that, right? So that's why we. But people do really follow the drama of the like Netflix or Hulu, right? And so that's why when you think about how can we make the we bring some entertainment kind of test to the education contents. What that means is people will open that more and watch that more and try to get into the story and trying to learn from there, right? And so that's why like entertainment plus education become one of very good things that we have there. And when we talk with partners, they are thinking about expanding to their contents globally. But while Japan is one of the things they are not aware of, and they don't have anyone to speak Japanese in that company. So via that program, actually I met with these partners and we signed a strategic partnership. So now we are helping land to bring all those kind of education contents from Europe to Japan.
Really?
Yes, and we help them to do the localization and distribution.
Is this your company but other business?
Yes.
I see.
Yes, so it's also like offering to the B2B as well. We also offer that to the companies and to basically that will kind of cross cultural communications and DEIs and agile mindset, design thinking, and how can you have unconscious bias. So it's very focused on the soft skill parts about how can we help the team to communicate well, help the leadership to build the way how they should lead the team, right? And how they should build out the businesses, right? So instead of just arranging for the mentors and the coaches, which is important as well, but we want to provide a fundamental kind of growing contents, for the older employees, as wide as possible to really get a chance to learn, right? And what to do. And we just figured about like that e-learning contents is the best for the directions that the business we're doing. So that's why we're collaborating with them, and to, again, that would connect to our company's mission is we want to help the companies in Japan to connect the world and to build a competitive products and business that's relevant to the consumers and be able to enrich people's life, right? And so that content will assist us by doing that. So, yeah.
Okay, so 2 years ago, when you got opportunity to go to Silicon Valley, you met a European company who has e-learning content company. They wanted to go to Japan, but they didn't have a connection. That's why your company became their partner to support introducing local Japanese companies and also localization, correct?
That's right.
Was it by chance you met, like at the cafe, hello, or JETRO introduced you?
Yeah, so that's not. So that was actually during the exhibition, right? Denjikai, right? So, and that's just education tech exhibitions. And while the company, their name is called Pinktum, and they have the booth, big booth there, and so that's why I just stopped by and saying hi, decided to explain who I am, and I'm very interested about knowing more details about your products. You know, can we get in contact? You know, we are probably not a buyer of your products, but we may be a collaborator to help you to expand your business globally, right? And so that's kind of how we got started, and so we end up shaking hands. So one thing I learned a lot is really not about waiting for someone to introduce you, the person to you. Is we really need to go global, right? If I didn't go to the U.S., if I didn't go to the Silicon Valley, probably I never get a chance to talk to this company, even know this company is existing, right? And so founders, I think for the AI founders mindset, one thing is very important is really about is already exploring the world, right? It's by going to the places and to meeting up with people, meeting up the opportunities, and be open and don't have the biases about like international things probably doesn't fit Japan, right? And so, but in fact, we actually seen about a lot of companies was like the contents a lot after seeing this. I really hope like we can be in the places about like to really introduce the working professionals and companies something they don't know, they never tried before. We hope it can become one of the enabler, right? And to bring them to the world of what are the things the growing company should have, right? And that will kind of shaping up their future as well. So yeah, so that is something like I will really appreciate actually JETRO to give this huge opportunities and to bring a startup founder like me and to get selected and to get a chance to visit the Silicon Valley. And now I feel about I'm paying forward as well, like also sharing with other founders as well, like how good that the program is. Yeah.
This is a great story. First of all, I really love and appreciate your open-minded personality. That's why last week I found you. We started to have a conversation and then decided to interview today. So anyway, I love your like pay forward mindset currently. And then do you want to aim to global this year? What do you think?
Yeah, I think like we are born global. Like we are having the global mindset from day one when we set up company. So right now, the business coaches or instructors on our platforms, more than 70% are from outside of Japan, and 30% are in Japan. But most of them are bilingual. They speak Japanese, they speak English as well, and so that's why they will be able to provide a service for our clients in Japan. But that will also give us a very good angle possibility when we expand globally to US, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, to Korea, to Taiwan, to all the kind of places, because we have the international coaches and mentors kind of on our back, and we are they are supporting our clients, and same time we want to support in this community as well, this coaching communities. And that's in the past you can see there are not too many like when in Japan it was called so-called external board directors like coming from outside of Japan.
Yes, yes.
Right. But we need to have this kind of global mindset or perspective and in the Japanese companies and to really to kind of inspires and to doing that. So I hope this kind of business can eventually will help to provide a very strong board director talent pool for the company when they only not just need an advisor, they even go get a lot of foreign experts that have the more than 20 years experience in their domain function areas. We see there are ex-CEO of American Apparel. They can be a good board directors for the fashion industries or the companies who are thinking about expand their business globally, right? And we have a talent development experts who used to work in a Dell, right? And for 10 plus years. And so we can also shape up how the talent development teams in Japan, in your company, to think about how can you really grow the global level of the managers, have the global mindsets and employees as well. So with that, we really hope about it's really about senpai kohai kind of relationship as well. It's not that far. We are not learning from someone is far in the future, but we are learning maybe someone who have the 20 years experiences, and this person can be can assist in the company grow as well. So with that things what I feel about is really connected to global. For Japanese company to connect to the global talents advisors in that sense directly.
Currently, do you have any pain points? Maybe I can help you, and also our audience also can help you.
Right, and so as this knowledge education tech business, we really need a lot of collaborators, and on both the supply side and the demand side as well. So on the supply side, who have the domain knowledges, like subject matter experts. Like you don't need to have 40 years experience. Maybe you have 10 years at a certain domain knowledges. Then we really hope to help that people to be able to shine on their skills they have globally. So we really are reaching out to a lot of leadership coaches or design thinking or change management or scrum masters, the people who have the certain domain knowledges and to be able to join us on our platform to be able to offer your knowledge and expertise to others. And on demand side as well, and we are talking with a lot of clients in Japan. Thanks, we already have some of the clients that are using our services, but we still want to have more to talk to. And I feel about people. There is probably no one single company can say their organization is perfect. Every company have their own pain points and problems. We hope we'll be able to kind of sit down with them to get a thinking about I really have the mindset about if I'm working in your company, what should I do or what would I do, right? And to be able to use that angles and to build the required knowledge to help them to hit their goals about how can they be more innovative, and to try the new business, to expand the business globally. And so those kind of talent development parts, we also will hope, if there are clients we have some pain points, don't just worry about yourself, then just easily just reach out and to have the exploring the code with me and with my team, and so we will be more than happy to collaborate on our demand side as well. And the collaborator as the ecosystem. The ecosystem is kind of hard to build it up. So the collaborators who are, currently working with HR teams or working on the recruiting parts of things, I do believe it's not by filling up the candidates is important, but at the same time to be able to help to fine-tune the organization, to be able to know about what kind of talents is actually required. It's also important pieces. So we're also looking forward to work with more and more like recruiting partners, right? Yes, and to really their note about how can we really come up with the best job descriptions and what kind of talents were required for these companies, right? And to get it to help the organization to find the right person, right fit for that. So we also were more than happy to get in more discussion with the recruiting partners as well.
Okay, so last question. It's end of March of 2025. So do you have any news? For example, you are joining SushiTech Tokyo or other countries conference, or do you have some milestone in this year?
Yes. So actually, this is a good timing. So we are about to announce a new features for our AI agents, right? And so in the past, we are focused on the internal communications, how can we make more efficient and to increase the results for internal employees, right? And now we are announcing that we also can handle for the external inquiry as well. So we work with the partners that's in the law firm industries. So the law firm industries right now, a lot of companies still using the phone and fax machine to send the inquiries to the law firms. So right now we are driving the digital transformations for that industries to be able to use AI as the interactive communication ways in between the law firm and the clients. And so the result is we'll be able to help the law firm to filter out the right and quality user that their expertise can solve their problems. And for the clients, that means they will have the 24 hours available, right? Agent to talk to.
Wow.
Yeah, when I have some concern, sometimes somebody steal my monies or something, I have to fight with my wife, or there's kind of some issues, but you really need someone to talk to, but without being paying to the lawyer right away, and should that be something in between for you to ask the questions, get some of the advices, right, to get started with. And so then when you really need that service, then you will further engage with that lawyer, right? So yeah, that's kind of sort of we trying to build the AI agents to help the jimuin, right? So like admin in the companies to be able to handle more things with less time possible, right? And so and there are quite a lot of industries that will require digital transformations with the empowered by the AI tools. But right now we kind of announcing about we're getting to the kind of law firm kind of industries. So with that, I mean, this year's we've been reaching out with more lawyer, regardless it's B2B or it's B2C type of the lawyers, agency, regardless of size, how many lawyers and companies or individuals like office, right, jimusho, right, so only by yourself. Then you will be able to need AI to help you to connect the dots, right? Connect your cases to your services, right? And so we hope this AI tools will be able to become that connection. I hope so the hope for this year is I hope like in 2026 there will be no lawyer still use the fax machine, right? And to receive the cases. Right, so that's kind of things that I think step forward about which I like a lot is the AI and digital transformation to help the good service providers be able to achieve more by spending less time on the operations and logistics efforts.
Wonderful. Please check website and also Eric's LinkedIn, right? Yeah, okay. It's amazing. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me here, and I will regret to coming back again.
Yes. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Eric, part 2. 1. Timelyhero Global Pivot. How a drama-based learning deals sparked international growth. 1. Going global starts with showing up and speaking up. Why it matters. Eric didn't want to for a perfect introduction. during a JETRO-supported accelerator, he walked up to a booth at an edtech conference in Silicon Valley and introduced himself. That bold moment led to a strategic partnership with a major European e-learning company. By proactively introducing his company during an education exhibition, Eric formed a partnership with Pinktum, a top European provider of e-learning content, helping them localize and expand into Japan. Founders must explore the world with an open mind, not just wait for luck or introductions. 2. Education plus entertainment equal powerful learning. Why it matters? Most corporate training is boring. Eric realized that professionals prefer engaging, story-driven content, like what they enjoy on Netflix or Hulu. Example, through the Pinktum partnership, Timelyhero now offers drama-style e-learning videos, topics like DEI, agile thinking, and leaderships, helping Japanese professionals absorb soft skills in a fun and relatable way. When learning feels like entertainment, people watch more, remember more, and grow faster. 3. AI agents are transforming time-heavy industries, starting with law. Why it matters? Many industries in Japan, like legal service, still rely on fax and phone calls. Timelyhero is delivering AI agents to support communication and efficiency both inside companies and with clients. Eric's team building AI agent to help law firms filter and provide 24/7 guidance, freeing up lawyers to focus on high-value cases. His hope? By 26, no more fax machines in law firms. AI isn't just for tech companies. It can bring digital transformation to traditional industries too. Okay, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's conversation will help your future and career. If you like it, please subscribe us and give you a like. Thank you so much. Bye bye. またね。チャオ。